Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Christy Lemaster. I'm the Assistant Curator of Public Programs here at the Museum of Contemporary Art. We are so delighted to be presenting a talk today by our very loved adjunct curator, Lynne Warren. Today's talk is an Art Speaks lecture put on by the Graham School of the University of Chicago. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce to you, it's my great pleasure, Hong Brunner, the program manager of the Liberal Arts and Sciences of the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Please help me welcome Hong.
Well, thank you. We are, of course, honored. I'm on behalf of University of Chicago's Graham School to be partnering with Lynne Warren and MCA to present this lecture, which is generously underwritten by the Terra Foundation. As you all know, Terra Foundation is running this year-long Art Design Chicago project with a lot of public exhibits of art and design and photography too. The idea is to really hope to put Chicago on the map. It's my honor and privilege to have here Lynne Warren present this lecture to us today. Lynne is a longtime adjunct curator of MCA, and she specializes in Chicago art history. And I am personally a big fan of her research and writing, and I'm sure everybody else will benefit greatly from her lecture today. So without further ado, Lynne Warren.
Thank you, Hong, and thank you so much for having followed my career a bit and inviting me to take part in this lecture series, which has been going on for a while and will continue. And I'm sure you can find more information about the lecture series on the Graham School's website, as well as the Terra Initiative website. And I want to thank them as well for funding this whole initiative, because I did the Art in Chicago project back in 1996, and what is happening this year with the Terra Initiative is what I thought would just happen right away in the late 90s, ongoing. But it took a little while for this attention to Chicago's art history to really reach a maturity level, and I do really want to thank the Terra Foundation. I've been told that we have an hour and a half, and I am going to take advantage of that. I have a lot of slides, but I think you'll find them interesting. It's not always boring artwork. It's texts, historical texts that are really fascinating. So the title of my talk really comes from, excuse me, I wrote a little sidebar essay in the publication that's coming out, I think in the fall, that accompanies the Terra Initiative. And the topic was Curating Chicago. So when I was asked to do this talk, I thought, well, I should just take that and run with it, because it's a really interesting topic that hasn't really been thoroughly researched. So I tried to thoroughly research it. It's a broad topic, and I actually start with the post-war era. Well, I actually start with 1940, so during the war, and then the post-war era. And I bring it kind of up to the present, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. But I do want to just read you the opening paragraphs in the little essay I wrote for this Terra Initiative book that will really set the scene of what this project of mine is here today. Often those who've been on the scene for many years, as have I, stress how much things have changed. But in regards to, quote, curating Chicago, unfortunately things, until very recently, have stayed too much the same. For many decades of the 20th century, Chicago's major arts institutions grappled with the issue of how and how often to show local artists. Various strategies were employed, but few launched or sustained careers beyond the city. Most successful Chicago artists of the 1950s through the 80s had either moved away, like H.C. Westerman, Leon Golub, Nancy Sparrow, or were, if known at all, typed as regional figures like Jim Nutt, Ed Paschke, Ellen Lanyon. Some managed a national presence without the conventional institutional support of initial exposure in emerging formats, mid-career surveys, and full-blown traveling retrospectives that also were accompanied by substantial catalogs, like Harry Callahan, Richard Hunt, or Henry Darger. But these are the exceptions that sort of prove the rule. For nationally and internationally focused institutions such as the Art Institute of Chicago or the Museum of Contemporary Art, where I've spent my career, how to handle local artists was framed by the, quote, second city label, resulting in the fear of being dismissed as parochial if too much attention was paid to the local. As it played out, given the imperative for major museums to bring to Chicago exhibitions that may not otherwise be able to be viewed, a Chicago artist was much more likely to be introduced to dozens of national and international figures than be tapped for an exhibition. For much of Chicago's history, the best way to ensure an exhibition was not by courting a curator, but by organizing that exhibition yourself. From Rudolf Weisenberg's anti-Chicago and vicinity effort, the Introspectives, and a Salon de Refusés that was held at a department store in 1921, to the now legendary exhibition momentum shows to the women's co-ops and alternative spaces of the 70s, to the apartment galleries of the 90s, Chicago artists did not sit around waiting to be discovered. While these efforts took some pressure off institution-based curators to show local work, they also provided opportunities for curators to connect with new artists, occasionally resulting in an exhibition. But when these exhibition opportunities did arise, there was a long-standing conundrum. How was it best to serve Chicago artists? Present them as locals or integrate them into the larger program? So what we're really going to explore here today is the sort of swing back and forth between those two ends of the spectrum. So I start out with a definition of my terms. So boosterism, the enthusiastic promotion of a person, organization, or cause. Civic duty, a social force that binds one to the courses of action demanded by that force. So here's the civic duty boosterism spectrum. So we'll start out with the Art Institute because it really is the major institution that affected much of the history, having been founded in the late 19th century and coming to the present date of how they have looked at Chicago artists really tells a very interesting history. So way back when, there was a Municipal Art League that voted to establish a municipal art collection to be formed of works of artists who have been active in the artistic life of the city. The object being the encouragement of works of art worthy to be in a public gallery. The Municipal Art League is an organization presented of life, associate, and active members and 70 affiliated clubs represented by 2 to 4 delegates. The object of the league is to promote civic art, the fine arts, industrial arts, and to stimulate civic pride in the care and improvement of public and private property. The affiliated clubs are pledged to a special interest in the work of artists of Chicago and vicinity and to encourage and promote in every possible way their annual exhibition. I think that's sort of ground zero of boosterism. There was also an organization founded at the Art Institute called the Society of Contemporary American Art, and that's a precursor to the current Society of Contemporary Art. This one was American art only. Here's how they worked that, actually. This is an exhibition from 1941, as you can see, and they asked local collectors to nominate artists. So this was a really interesting way to not only work with their collector base and their donor base, but to get artists involved. And these are the Chicago-based artists. So this wasn't just a Chicago program, it was, a national American program. You see there at the very end, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was one of our Chicago artists at that time. So we have a long history of claiming these people, even though they're national, international figures. And I'd say this is sort of the way of, the sort of the middle of the spectrum, just integrating Chicago artists into existing programs like nationally based programs. So now we have to come to the annual exhibitions of artists of Chicago and vicinity. And these were started back in the 19th century, and they went on for years. And often they were just sort of straight out boosterism, but like in this example, they produced a WPA poster to publicize the show, and it was really about writing the L. So the Chicago Transit Authority probably paid for it to make this, fancy, beautiful poster, but that kind of moves it more into a boosterism category. So in 1943, there was also something at the Art Institute, which I wasn't able to find too much documentation about, so I don't have any fancy slides, called the Room of Chicago Art. Has anyone in the audience ever heard of that? I think they tried to bury the idea, but there were actually 6 exhibitions featured in this room just in the year 1943. And toward the end of my talk, I probably won't remember to call this up again, but that kind of shadows one of the things that we did here at the MCA with our 12 by 12 program. So there was a group exhibition called Painting and Sculpture by Negro Artists as part of that. So they did not just 1-person and 2-person shows, but they did group shows. In 1947, there were 7 of these exhibitions. So that's a pretty fast rotation, including a 2-person show of Gertrude Abercrombie. And in 1945, they did 6 shows. In 1946, now this is all during the war and right after the war, they did 6 shows. And in 48, only 3 shows. And then by 49, there was no more Room of Chicago artists. So I'm not exactly sure what happened. It's just interesting to look at some of the artists that really did get a lot of attention. This is one of the jurors of that 43 Chicago and Vicinity show, who was all over the place in Chicago in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and was an amazing sculptor and did this fantastic bust portrait of John F. Kennedy. But I'd never heard of him before. Has anyone heard of Freeman L. Schoolcraft? No. So at the same time as the Art Institute was doing the Chicago and Vicinity shows, which were annual shows, they did annual shows of American artists, so the annual American exhibitions. They started a little bit later than the Chicago and Vicinity shows, but it's interesting to see the sort of play between the Chicago-only shows and, excuse me, these annual American shows, because they did include Chicago artists in them. At this point, abstract art had started to creep in. This show included Calder, and it included a number of other abstract artists. You can see from the names, like right up front, it says Ivan Albright. So the Chicago artists were really included with all these various nationally based American artists, many of whom were recent immigrants from the European War, as it was often called. So for this particular show, which was it remains a legendary show that the Art Institute did, mirroring a very legendary show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York of abstract and surrealist artists. They really had to sort of explain to the Chicago audience For some reason not readily explicable, an overwhelmingly large number of American artists have recently, since the end of Second World War, turned toward the abstract idiom, because before the war in Chicago, there was hardly any abstraction, and the artists that practiced it weren't celebrated in any way. This includes both painters and sculptors. To those who have followed carefully the abstract movement in Europe, this sudden interest in America may seem a belated afterthought, for it was almost 40 years ago that Picasso and Braque started their first Cubist experiments in Paris. We must face the fact today that in the United States, many serious artists are still concerned with abstract problems, which Europe solved some years ago. I mean, this is the director of the Art Institute, Daniel Caton Rich, writing this text. This is inevitable. For that matter, our country has no less than others, even now, has its contingent of derivative impressionists stemming from an even earlier, outmoded 19th century movement. So they're not pulling any punches here. So to properly find the artists for this abstract and surrealist show, we were obliged to find out what was actually going on, not alone in New York, the ever popular hunting ground, but throughout the entire country in the controversial Middle West. Now, I don't really know why it was controversial. On the active West Coast, in the less productive South, and of course along the Eastern Seaboard. We found that often the most banal and uninteresting art was being produced in the better-known art colonies. Conversely, where we least expected to meet vigorous and original work, that is, in Midwestern and small Western towns, we often found it. But in these cases, the artists in question were usually connected with progressive departments in large universities or colleges. Now that sounds like something that's still going on today. And he mentions a few of them. The experimental artist seems to live an easier life economically in these smaller centers, but he pays heavily for his comfort with loneliness. This is before the internet for you younger people. He has few, if any, associates with whom he can discuss the work. And as a rule, his neighbors have no understanding whatsoever of what he's trying to do. Unfortunately, in American art circles, the exchange of ideas through good conversation is usually accompanied by high rents. So that's just a fascinating text from that surrealist and abstract catalog. So what happens very soon after these early post-war Chicago vicinity shows and the American shows, which, again, Chicago artists were put in many of those shows, is that the Art Institute decides, because they're getting all this pressure from the old-timers, those people still doing all that impressionism, and the non-abstract art, all those artists that don't do abstract art, they were really upset that the younger artists that were starting to graduate starting to attend the School of the Art Institute were entering these shows and winning the prizes. For instance, Ellen Lanyon entered that show that we just saw, the annual show, and she won a $100 prize. And I actually looked that up on the internet. There's this site where you can find out how much $100 is worth today. And if you just say, oh, for inflation, it's like not that much. But considering that would have been income, a $100 prize in the 40s was worth $11,000 of income, because rents were very, very cheap, like maybe $25 a month, if that. And living expenses were very, very cheap. So $100 would go a long way. So you can see maybe why there was this resentment that these students were coming in and stealing the thunder of the artists who just expected that they would be in these shows because they had been in the community so long and worked so hard. So Ellen Lanyon, along with a number of other people, including Leon Golub and H.C. Westerman and others, founded these alternative exhibitions with a group called Exhibition Momentum. This is the catalog for the initial show in 1948. It's a very beautiful catalog. It's very highly designed, and I actually just did a segment that will be for, and I'm going to plug an upcoming Terra Initiative project, a 4-part documentary that WTTW is doing on the Chicago art scene, and they're concentrating on the alternative history of Chicago. So I just did a segment, excuse me, where I handle this catalog and show the graphic qualities of it. It's quite a beautiful piece. But these artists were very, very clear about what was going on. Exclusion was the thing that brought about exhibition momentum. The difficulty in making any counter move is that the body making the move tends to isolate itself and in turn become exclusive. Therefore, it would not be wise to emphasize the protest of a thing that is already stale. So this is a not so, it's a pretty heavy-handed slight against those artists that were complaining about these new artists coming in and stealing the thunder. They're already stale. We can't even bother to protest them. Rather, we must go on as a group which remains completely non-exclusive. Thus, we are not protesting any one small group, but are standing in time as a counterbalance to the exclusivist tendencies in paren of the Art Institute of Chicago. So how did the Art Institute react? The next show they did of the Chicago artists of Chicago and vicinity the next year had no jurors. It was all selected by Art Institute curators. Now, there had been jurors brought in forever to select the works, which often ended up with, kind of strange mix. Now, Exhibition Momentum actually took that model and brought in very high-powered artists to jury their shows. And they brought in people like Jackson Pollock and, Franz Klein and people like that. So it was interesting that at the time that Exhibition Momentum, which started in 48 and continued to 57, was bringing in these high-powered jurors, the Art Institute decided, nope, we can't do that anymore. No jurors, we'll select things, ourselves in-house. This cover, for those of you who are big Chicago art fans, is by Richard Capa. And actually, Joan Mitchell shows for the first time in this Chicago and vicinity show in 1949. So the Art Institute, is kind of polemical at this time. And here's another statement from this catalog of artists of Chicago and vicinity, why they selected this method. It was adopted by the Institute for several reasons. In the last few years, despite different juries, Chicago exhibitions had taken on a great sameness. Certain artists, it was found, were not sending in their work. We suspected that others had paintings or sculpture or prints in their studios which they did not consider of exhibition size or significance, though these sometimes proved to be their most sincere and original expression. Now that's a real curator talking there. So I'm just going to run through some slides of the ongoing annual exhibitions of Chicago and vicinity. In 51, this is the first time significant numbers of the younger generation of the post-war era of Chicago artists show up, such as Don Baum, George Cohen, Miyoko Ito, June Leaf, Ellen Lanyon, and Evelyn Statzinger. And we are continuing with the annual American exhibitions, which also stopped having jurors around this time. And became selected by Art Institute curators. The prizes are given by a juror of award that would consist of New York artists or New York critics. Now, for this show, only about 10% of the 178 artists that were shown were local people. And this included, interestingly, the African-American self-taught sculptor Marion Perkins, who the Art Institute actually has some amazing works by him in their collection that they acquired out of shows like this. The jurors for this particular show were Peter Bloom, who is a painter in the Art Institute's collection, and Hans Hofmann, who seemed to jury a lot of things back then. I don't know where he found the time. And it's just interesting seeing the sort of vintage feel of those black and white photos. Now, these annual American shows are very, very important because they brought into the Art Institute collection pieces like this, the famous excavation. And it was one of the shows, one of the pieces shown in that show, and it was purchased with this Mr. and Mrs. Frank G. Logan Purchase Prize Fund. Now, those were the funds that younger artists were tending to win, and the older Chicago artists were complaining about that kind of sparked exhibition momentum. Now, the Art Institute was really obviously very influenced by exhibition momentum. So they decided to do a no jury exhibition showing 2,671 works. It was selected by, the awards were given out by a 5-person jury, including the Art Institute's director. And all the usual artists that had shown in vicinity shows did enter this show. But it was really interesting how they dealt with it. And this was actually at Navy Pier, because the Art Institute, they had closed down Gonzales Hall, which is where the Armor used to be, where they often showed the Chicago and vicinity shows to be renovated around this time. So they showed this out at Navy Pier, where Exhibition Momentum had been showing some of their shows. So they showed the works in alphabetical order, beginning with the letter K, which this letter was chosen by lot. I mean, obviously they were being very careful about how, since there's no jury, how do you deal with these massive numbers of pieces and not offend anyone? Sculpture is displayed in accordance with available space for the best presentation. And most of the works in this exhibition are for sale. Now, pretty much, this was a very common thing at the Art Institute. Pretty much all the Chicago and vicinity shows, everything was for sale. And they would actually have a little desk set up that you could go talk to. And for a while, they had a sales and rental gallery that they also used for this purpose. It was also interesting to see this 1957 no jury show with all these co-sponsoring organizations, some of which are still around, like the Evanston Art Center and the Renaissance Society, and there at the very bottom, the Southside Community Art Center, which I just learned got some kind of historic landmark status, which is congratulations to them. That's fantastic. So this listing of all these different organizations really shows the sort of communities that were brought in, both the commercial communities, because it's art supply stores and things like that, and then various, like the Midwest Designer Craftsmen, so various sort of craftsman group. It was bringing a lot of people together. So the Art Institute's 62nd, I guess they decided to use Roman numerals for this one, also had no jurors and included a number of up-and-coming Chicago artists like Don Baum, Miyoko Ito, Roland Ginsel, Richard Hunt, and Ellen Lanyon. That's actually a Ruth Azara work on the cover there, who's not a Chicago artist and been getting a lot of play recently, a Japanese-American artist who just recently died. Her work is amazing. So now we start going into the 60s. They reverted back with the Chicago vicinity shows to a system of jurors. I guess they did all that no jury stuff, and by 1960s, Exhibition Momentum was no longer mounting shows. Many of those artists had left Chicago. It was a very different scene. So at the same time, the Art Institute was starting to mount some major one-person exhibitions of Chicago artists, like Ivan Albright, and he has a show up right now at the Art Institute as part of the Terra Initiative. His current show is called Flesh. So we're moving into the 60s. You can see they're, again, doing jurors, people like Larry Rivers and Wayne Thiebaud. But not a lot of recognizable names in this show. Dominic DeMeo was in it, Ted Halkin, Miyoko Ito. And it was a very select group. Only 60 artists were chosen for this. So coming down from the almost 200 of earlier vicinity shows, it seems really clear they were going, we can't just show everybody, we have to be more selective. And then for the first time, artists associated with the Chicago School of the 1970s were shown. So it's including Sue Ellen Roca. So it's just so fascinating to see the school that we associate so much with Chicago really creeping in at this point. Including Jim Nutt started showing in these shows. This is his Misty Garment piece, which the Art Institute has, they bought it from this. Here's an exhibition slide, a view of that Chicago and Vicinity exhibition. So by the end of the 60s, they stopped using the word annual in their title. You wouldn't have probably noticed that, but they did stop using that. Here's an installation view. That's a Ray Yoshida there. And then they expanded the radius of the show. Before, it had been a 100-mile radius. So they expanded it to a 130-mile radius and then bumped up the number of artists that they could show. And here's a couple of the prize winners from that show. I vaguely recognize the names, but I can't say that I know those artists very well. And then the Art Institute's Chicago and Vicinity shows start getting very few and far between. And by 1980, they've done a prize winners revisited, and they've installed it in the staircase at the back of the museum. We'll hear a little bit more about this soon. You can see a Gladys Nilsson there in the middle. But they also were showing some other local artists. I remember this Ed Paschke's show was really kind of controversial. Should the Art Institute do it? I was here at the MCA at the time. Should it be the MCA doing it? But the Art Institute won out. Good for Ed. And then there is the Chicago show. How many of you have heard of the Chicago show? Yeah, okay, good. Got some people here have heard of it. It was initiated by the Art Institute of Chicago, held at the Cultural Center in 1990. It developed headlines like "Cowardice and Politics Ruin the Chicago Show" by our recently dear departed Jim Ude, and "Minority Artists Blast City Exhibit." From the Chicago Tribune, a group of minority artists are calling for a boycott of an exhibition of local artists organized by the Art Institute, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs, claiming they were shortchanged in the number of works selected for viewing. Though the complaints have been rebutted, the controversy caused the event's major sponsor, the Continental Bank, to cut its financial support from $100,000 down to $50,000. The judges consisted of 3 white curators, one each from Art Institute, Museum of Contemporary Art, me, and the Cultural Affairs Department. The 3 curators selected the other 2 jurors, a black artist and a Hispanic artist. That would have been Marva Jolie, who was a ceramicist, and Paul Sierra, the painter. These 5 selected the work of only, the word only is not in there, but that's what they meant, 6 minority artists and 84 white artists for display. Now, this was a blind jury. The artist names were not attached to these slide submissions. And it turns out that we actually selected about the percentage of, quote, minority artists that had entered the show. But the problem was the word wasn't gotten out properly. Minority artists had not been terribly involved in the Chicago and vicinity shows up to that time. So they just didn't really enter. So what happened that no one liked was that the Cultural Center and the Art Institute, not so much me here at the MCA, invited a bunch of artists into the show, just, minority artists. So they curated some artists into the show, which made the artists who had gotten into the show in the blind jury not feel real great about themselves. It was a mess. I remember apologizing for that for decades. It was my colleagues, Greg Knight was the the Cultural Center curator, and Neil Ben Ezra, who's now director of the San Francisco Art Museum, was the Art Institute curator. So Greg had a lot of Chicago experience, and so did I, but Neil not so much. So we selected what we thought were really interesting pieces, but I recognized some of the entrants. Other people recognized some of the entrants, but it just didn't satisfy anyone. It was an outmoded device at this point. These sort of blind jurors with people coming from institutions to represent their institutions, and then having some artists involved. And it just was a mess. So after the Chicago show, the Art Institute stopped doing any forms of exhibitions that obviously showcased local artists. And then, of course, they built the modern wing. Now, to be fair, the Art Institute over the years always showed a lot of Chicago artists in departments like the photography department. I mean, they showed many, many, many Chicago-based artists. And that has been taken up subsequently. This show, taken by Design, photographs from the Institute of Design, was in 2002, and yet it was in the photography galleries. And then more recently, the City Lost and Found, which was it opened in 2014. And it has a work as its poster boy by Kenneth Josephson. And I hope you've all been able to visit our Terra-supported Kenneth Josephson picture fiction show that's up just right adjacent to this hall. So then I'm going to move a little bit more quickly to the Renaissance Society. Now, the Renaissance Society was founded as a Kunsthalle in 1915, so it's also a venerable institution. It was founded by a group of University of Chicago faculty, and the name refers to their intention to create a space in which to foster engagement with new ideas in arts and culture. Now, the cynical amongst us might go, well, that leaves Chicago artists out because they've been sort of roundly condemned for looking backwards and not being interested in new ideas like abstraction and so forth and so on. But the Renaissance Society really kind of took their need to involve the local community pretty seriously. And they started, again, this lecture just deals with 1940 and forward, but they continued doing a lot of Chicago-based shows, and you can just see this one, Works by Chicago Artists, loaned by Chicago collectors, always a good thing to have donors involved. And you see at the top there, Gertrude Abercrombie, Ivan Albright. It's kind of all the usual suspects from that era. Or a show called Representative Works by Chicago Artists. Titles are really kind of plain back then. And during this time frame that this show was on, and again, you see a lot of the usual suspects being shown here, but you see Archibald Motley there in the group of names, which is really wonderful. During the 46-47 season, approximately 180 works have been included in the regular program of the Ren, and an exhibition sponsored by the Student Committee. In its future program, the Society intends to continue its policy of including Chicago artists whenever possible. And they did continue that. Here's another show, Form and Play, Abstraction in Various Materials. And it includes, this is the whole sort of Institute of Design group, which you didn't see entering a lot of the Chicago and vicinity shows. The Chicago and vicinity shows at the Art Institute were mostly School of the Art Institute students. But here you see many of the instructors, including Laszlo Moholy-Nagy himself, and Hugo Weber and John Wally. So they were really kind of looking beyond the kind of Art Institute's catchment area, I guess you would call it. To bring it up to the 80s, I remember these shows, but I had forgotten about them until I started doing research. A series called Emerging, which had a very interesting way of bringing the artists to the exhibition, which is they invited Chicago critics, collectors, curators, non-artists, in other words, to nominate an artist. So each of these artists would have been nominated by a specific person. Now, they didn't reveal who nominated whom, which was interesting. But these names are all very familiar to me, many of whom, unfortunately, haven't really sustained careers. We see Jim Lutz there in the first column. He's sustained quite a wonderful career. So they unfortunately did this emerging only twice, in 83 and 85, and I don't know why they discontinued it. But this is the second in the series. This group of artists are people that that were really the artists on the scene at that time that I all knew very well. I mean, we see Jin-Soo Kim there at the bottom, who's continued to do a pretty interesting career. But unfortunately, a lot of these names are not on everybody's lips right now. But they were emerging artists. That was the point. Now, the Wren has done a really pretty impressive group of solo exhibitions of Chicago artists. And again, they did them pre-war, but you can look through the line there and we see Phyllis Bramson in 1986. Phyllis is with us here today. A number of the, imagists, but not just imagism. And it goes all the way up to date now with the show that's on view, Richard Rezac, at the Wren right now, which I hope you've all got a chance to see. It closes next week, I think, for those of you putting off seeing the show. It's really quite wonderful. But like all institutions in the 21st century, they really start looking at presenting Chicago artists in a different way. And you can see there at the bottom, it's like their role is really more to focus on the relationship to the larger Chicago community. And they did it, in this case, by bringing in a Belgian artist who worked with some Chicago figures. And this is her show. So overall, the Renaissance Society, I think they were more insulated, particularly because they weren't a collecting institution, from some of these stresses. So I just give them a middle of the road, like we're just integrating this into our entire program, which is a very good thing. Now we come to the Museum of Contemporary Art. This is a photo of the building as it looked on Ontario Street, 237 East Ontario Street, just south. After it was remodeled to bring in the townhouse there that's on the side, that was where Gordon Motta Clark cut the thing apart and created his last work. So the Museum of Contemporary Art, of course, is a much more recent institution, only starting in 1967. And we had our 50th anniversary last year, which was really nice. So it's got a little bit of a different profile. But from the very beginning, even in these big group shows like this is the first show, people like Jim Nutt were included. And this was something that the curator and the director, who was European, just felt that's the normal way to do things, just integrate Chicago artists in. I love these old installation shots. They're really quite lovely. Things hung on a curtain. Did you notice that? So a show like Fantastic Drawings, which would have been, looking at the surrealist influence that collectors had really brought to our town, included people like Don Baum and George Cohen and Marianne, who is kind of interesting artist who's not thought about much today. But I just really, again, love these photos of openings because you could smoke in the galleries. And there's what really would be old master drawings that are hanging behind him. There's a Picabia there and Picasso. So, again, we were founded in '67. So as the big group shows went on, this one, Violence in Recent American Art, had Ralph Arnold, who's going to have a Terra Initiative-sponsored show. Stanley Edwards, Paul Lamantia, Ellen Lanyon was in the show, Ben Mahmoud, Dominic DeMeo. This was a really interesting, again, landmark show that the MCA did, and included, again, a number of Chicago artists, which is really nice. And also at the same time, there were a number of solo shows being organized. This one in '69 of H.C. Westerman, who had not been in Chicago for decades at this point, but was still claimed as a Chicago artist, and this show actually traveled, which was really nice. And here we have not Austin Powers, but our founding director, Jan Vandermark, at the opening of a very seminal show called Don Baum Says Chicago Needs Famous Artists. And you can see some of those paintings behind him. And here's some of those famous artists at the opening. That's Carl Worson there in the middle and talking to his wife, Lori Gunn. And that's Ed Paschke between them. I would like to think drinking punch, right? And another artist that is going to be put into a show that the Terra is sponsoring at the Tang Museum, Stephen Uri, who's really not well known, but is a sort of imagist sculptor. So there was a major show by Hammond 69. This is a piece that we acquired, not directly from the show, but probably as a result of that show. And that becomes a very important thing that's happening. Like the Art Institute, which had a number of purchase prizes and brought in a lot of Chicago-based work into their collection during their vicinity shows and some of the American shows, the MCA realized it was really important to bring some of these artists into the collection as well. But what started to happen is you can see in 69, 3 imagist sort of shows, another imagist show in 71, Chicago Imagist Art in 72, Jim Nutt in 74, Leanne Golub in 74, considered one of the monster roster. Made in Chicago, which was all the imagists and some other people in 75, and Made in Chicago, some resources. There was really a kind of type of artist that was popping up, and it was the so-called Chicago School, which leads us to protest. A lot of Chicago artists were getting really upset with the fact that the MCA seemed only interested in showing the, imagist artist. So the MCA did a show called Abstract Art in Chicago, which harkens back to that abstract show the Wren did in the 40s, featuring a number of artists that many of them have gone on to nice careers. Some of them involved around institute design, but not all of them, like Richard Hunt, William Conger. And we also see Emilio Cruz, who's an artist who unfortunately was kind of forgotten until Naomi Beckwith rediscovered him and put him in her Freedom Principle show, a really pioneering African-American artist. So I showed that slide of the MCA as it looked in 1979 so that you could make a little sense out of this slide for those of you who didn't visit the old MCA building. That stack there on the right side of the MCA, the place that Gordon Matta Clark had cut apart, had been turned into a cafe on the lower level, a gallery, a stack of 3 galleries on the first, second, and third floor. And in 1979, I think it was, 1979, the BorgWarner Corporation, which was a big Chicago corporation, I think it's still around, I'm not sure if it's still in Chicago, that did auto parts, I think was one of their manufacturing. They donated to the Museum of Contemporary Art money to dedicate a Chicago gallery, Chicago and Vicinity Gallery, that would be only Chicago and Vicinity artists shown in that, called the BorgWarner Gallery. So Alan Artner, longtime art curator at art critic at the Chicago Tribune, wrote this at that time. So, oops, sorry. 2 weeks prior to its festive grand opening, the Museum of Contemporary Art yesterday opened its new BorgWarner Gallery. Oh no, I do have that as a slide. 2 weeks prior to its festive grand opening, the Museum of Contemporary Art opened its new BorgWarner Gallery for contemporary Chicago and vicinity art. Now, I never was able to find that that's what we named it, Chicago and vicinity art, but that's what Alan wrote in the newspaper. And perhaps the effect would have been better if everyone had waited. The traditional argument against such galleries always has been that they are not important. Local artists may exhibit in them, but that's still not the same as showing in the museum proper. So there's the Gallery for Chicago Artists and the museum proper, even though that gallery is in the museum. there's a sense that the art being shown in a locally oriented gallery is set apart from everything else, and while that may work to an artist's advantage, he often feels excluded rather than special. So this is a theme that's been developing in Chicago for a while. There is, of course, no way a museum can win in such a situation. If the MCA had waited to open the space on its March 23rd weekend of celebrations, some would say the Chicago exhibition was deliberately submerged in all the hoopla. But now others can maintain that the museum did not care enough to integrate local exhibitors into the large-scale festivities. There is never a shortage of ill will when it comes to the artists of Chicago. I mention it only because the MCA has done just about everything right. The Art Institute was a recipient of 5-year funding from the BorgWarner Corporation and immediately designated a rear stairwell as its new Chicago space. Remember that? So far as I know, there is no regular exhibition schedule at the Art Institute. Or if there is, everyone is keeping it quiet. By contrast, the MCA's gallery is in a well-appointed 18 by 77 foot long. There were these long, narrow galleries, not unlike this space, in which there will be 5 yearly exhibitions, each lasting 10 weeks. So this was a series called the BorgWarner Gallery of Chicago Art. There was a show in '79, I think this was the opening show, that featured Richard Beca, Phyllis Bramson. Do you remember that show, Phyllis?
Yeah, I didn't realize I wrote that all down.
Jerry Saltz, who we know now better as the Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic who wrote how being a failed artist had shaped him, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for that last year. Here he is in front of his drawings that were shown in that show of illustrations for Dante's Inferno. Now, this is important. I'm not highlighting him because he's a famous art critic now, as much as that he was one of the artists who founded Name Gallery. So here's where you really get this push-pull, again, of what the institutions are doing and how it's affecting the community. Here's some of the artists who founded Name Gallery. Phil Berkman, Joanne Elam, who was involved in the film group part of it, Otella Anderson, who's still here in the community, and so is Phil Berkman. Guy Whitney, who I think moved to New York and is no longer an artist. Barry Holden, same. And Jerry Saltz. And the other people in the photo were involved with Name, but were not founders of Name. Now, when these people were going to school at the School of the Art Institute, this is what the MCA was showing, to reiterate this slide. All that Imagist art. And I know from being on the scene at that time and spending a lot of time at Name Gallery, the artists that founded Name Gallery really despised Imagism. They wouldn't even walk into Phyllis Kind Gallery because it was yet another show of all those artists that they were so tired of, because that's kind of all they were seeing. So the fact that the MCA and Art Institute and other places were celebrating that we had a viable Chicago school at this point, there was a younger generation of artists that were very, very uninterested in that, because they were much more interested in things like installation art, filmmaking, video, performance. But the MCA really paid attention to that. And Name Gallery was founded in '73, so by '79, for that first BorgWarner Gallery show, Jerry Saltz was included in that, so that's like 6 years. And then the next show, which also happened in '79, featured a number of people who were showing in those alternative spaces, including Diane Simpson. Here's a piece, Ribbed Kimono, which was added to the MCA collection in '97, but is from that era of '79. And here she is at Artemisia Gallery putting together a one-person show of her corrugated cardboard sculptures. And she had definitely come to the attention of the MCA curators. It wasn't me, I wasn't doing these shows, through the Artemisia Gallery space. And it's very interesting because the Name Gallery came out of a sort of we don't like Chicago imagism, but the women's galleries really came out of, especially for the suburban-based artist, woman artist who was married and had a family, the feeling that they were not given proper attention, not so much because they were women, although that was part of it. Chicago had actually shown quite a few women all along, and there were a lot of women involved with the imagists, but that the women who lived in the suburbs and had families were considered dabblers and not serious artists. So that was some of the organizing principle for these artists to found their own galleries. This also included Margaret Wharton, and I heard Jean Albano closed her gallery today to come to this lecture, and she's with us, thank you. She represents Margaret. So Margaret Wharton showed in this early show, and we purchased a piece from that era in 1979 with a with the Illinois Arts Council grant, which you might remember the Illinois Arts Council once gave out purchase grants. And we collected a lot of Chicago artists through that. And then she also had a traveling solo exhibition in 1981. So another one of these BorgWarner shows featured Kay Rosen. And Kay Rosen actually comes from a different women's cooperative. This is a piece we purchased fairly recently in 2010, a wall painting called Yours, Ours. But here's Kay in a show, new work from Arc Gallery, which she was involved in. There she is, looking very young. And Arc, it was interesting, Artemisia early on joined the so-called Hubbard Street scene, and we're actually across the street from Name Gallery. Arc started out, I think, actually, maybe I'm wrong, maybe the Artemisia started out as well, but Arc definitely started out across the street from the MCA in a building that Marianne Deshan had a gallery in, and were really savvy in taking advantage of the fact that big crowds would come out to the MCA's opening, so they had their openings at the same time. Okay, yeah, I was right. Artemisia was in that same building and moved out to the Hubbard Street scene. So here's the diagram again. It turns out Alan Artner wasn't correct. There were only 4 Chicago artist shows in the BorgWarner Gallery. By 1982, and this was a 5-year grant, so this should have run through 1984, what was being shown in the BorgWarner Gallery was the permanent collection. But interestingly enough, for those of you who recognize some of these other names, the options show, although Marco Polo never heard of Chicago, its story really begins with him, was a show by Bob Peters, who's a longtime professor at the University of Chicago. So it was a big, strange installation and performance. So by this time, even though there was a dedicated gallery for Chicago art, the MCA was thinking, this isn't quite working just to have a dedicated gallery. We'll continue showing Chicago artists, but we may not show them in the BorgWarner Gallery. And then there's the Alternative Spaces show, which is a show I did in '84 that has sort of become one of the go-to shows that people always ask me about. And this was really stemming from my participation in a lot of the alternative spaces as a young curator who would visit them and look for new talent, and realizing that there was a lot there and it needed to be shown in an institutional format where the history could be recorded. So I published a catalog, and this chart has become kind of famous. It's going to be on one of the WTTW documentaries. But what I wanted to do, and in '84, I was told, do not do a chart in an art catalog. You know, Ad Reinhardt had done all those charts, and people really, they love them now, but they weren't, when he did them in the 40s, they were considered kind of, not what you should do with art. You can't chart it that way. But I started out with looking at the Chicago history, which goes back to the founding of the Art Institute. In the middle there, it follows through with artist colonies and important spaces in the 20s that kind of fed into the consciousness of people, and you see right there in the middle, Exhibition Momentum, who didn't have a space. They were a spaceless organization. But all the spaces with circles, those are all, they had galleries, they had dedicated galleries. And you can see how everything is sort of feeding into one another. And then in the the early 70s, you see this explosion of all these alternative spaces. And this was really reaction against the vicinity shows, which were getting old and tired, reaction against what the MCA was doing, showing only sort of one style of art. And it just enriched the scene to such an amazing degree and expanded the community in a way that I think today's young artists who continue to do apartment galleries and things like that, they just probably can't quite understand how that really revolutionized Chicago and Chicago art. And a lot of it was because the NEA was funding these spaces. So that was an important thing for them to keep going. And some of them kept going for many, many years. The show was in 84, so the chart cuts off. But at the point of 84, 10 years into the founding of many of these galleries, they were still going strong. And in fact, ARC Gallery is still around today. It's up on Damon near Webster, if you've lost track of it. So the MCA in 94, I don't have slides of all these because it's getting a little long. They started, the MCA in the old building, knowing that we were moving into this building in 96, did a whole bunch of solo shows of important local artists. We showed Jim Lutz, we showed Kay Rosen, Hollis Sigler. Dan Peterman was shown in the ongoing Option series, which was like very experimental work, but not a Chicago-based series. The museum hosted an exhibit by Jean Dunning, which was organized by the Hirshhorn. So in the 90s, we were really integrating the artists pretty much into our full program. So to inaugurate this building, this was the second show in this building, the then director, Kevin Kanzi, volunteered me to do the Art in Chicago project. And I know many of you in the room were involved in the community discussions we did. Many of you were selected and shown in that show. And what had happened is that Kevin Kanzi, who was not a native Chicagoan, estimated that there were some 50,000 serious artists who've worked in Chicago since 1945. Now, exactly where he came up with that, I'm not sure. However, that meant there were, 48,800 that wouldn't be in the Chicago Art in Chicago show. So it was a really interesting process. As I said, we worked hard to involve all communities, do roundtable discussions in many different communities, bring in a lot of different players, stakeholders, as we called them back then. But, still the press is going to be a little harsh. Jeff Hubner wrote a big cover story in the Chicago Reader at that time and says, needless to say, there will be some bitchers at the exhibition. And yes, there were a lot of artists, especially the artists who were very current at that time, the artists who had emerged in the 90s, many of whom could not be included because they were really just fairly recent artists, were particularly upset. But every once in a while I check on the sales of this book on Amazon, and I found this reader review recently, which just really, I had to share it with you. Narrow focus, provincial, myopic, smarmy, in-crowd, everything to turn you against the art world in Chicago as a clique justifying itself. So this is from last year. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, it is narrowly focused. It is provincial. It deals with Chicago. I don't know if it was smarmy. It definitely wasn't art in crowd because there were a number of artists that people hadn't ever heard of, like Marcos Raya, who's here with us today, who really was someone that had made such a career since the 60s, but had been kind of typecast as a muralist, and I think his debut in the Art in Chicago show was really important, if I say so myself. So I, of course, was in the press a lot at that point, and one of the things that I stated all the time was that I felt the museum should continue exhibiting Chicago artists without ghettoizing them, and not just to stick to local artists in a few group shows as appeasements. But years passed, and by 2001, there was a lot of Chicago artists were feeling they weren't very visible at the MCA. They were being integrated and purchased, and but there wasn't that spotlight on them. So the MCA started this 10-year series, as it turned out, of New Artists, New Work, the 12 by 12 show. And it presented over 100 Chicago artists, including some of the names you see here, some of whom have gone on, like Jason Lazarus and Edra Soto to be fairly well known, or Claire Rojas, William O'Brien. So this is just a shot from our web page, and you get an idea of the variety. I mean, it was a wide variety of artists, a wide variety of media. The problem with the 12 by 12 show is that it was very short. It was sort of like that Chicago room at the Art Institute, 7, 8, 9 a year, which meant you were up for 3 weeks or so because there was a week for installation. And the artists weren't given a publication, which is such an important thing. So after 10 years, the MCA's website is in reverse chronological order, so here we're going back to the beginning of the series. After 10 years, the MCA recognized that we weren't really helping the artists in the way we should by doing a very professional presentation with a catalog. So, picking up after the last 12 by 12, we started the current series, which is up right now with Paul Heyer, of the Chicago Work series. And to date, we've presented 17 Chicago-based artists, so that's quite a few less than the 100 shown in the 12 by 12. And you see some of the names. And in fact, we kind of repeated some of the 12 by 12 artists like Jason Lazarus. Here's some of the Chicago Works. They look just like the 12 by 12 shows up on the website, but they do have a small publication, and they're up for a much longer time. The very first show in that series was Scott Reeder. At the same time, we started this Ascendant Artist series. It wasn't initially called that, but that's the show that's over in the gallery to your left as you exit. The series always happens in that gallery. And we included people like Rashid Johnson, who had been one of our very early 12 by 12 shows. So these were shows that not only gave artists an opportunity, but then they got looked at by a lot of curators. And it turns out that Julie Whitholm, who's currently director of the DePaul Museum, saw the 12 by 12 show, the talent that was in there by Rashid, and did this show in 2012. It's one of our first Ascendant Artist shows. And then more recently, we have the Michael Rakowitz show, which just closed not long ago. And it's such a different scene now in the 20th century with the internet, with international travel, with all the galleries and the international art fairs, that artists are more based in Chicago rather than Chicago artists. And we're celebrating them very much as our Chicago artists, but there's just a really different profile. So to review, the civic duty boosterism spectrum. I think we've seen it really swing back and forth. Civic duty sometimes it's just a little bit too, you have to do it, and no one likes to be something that you are part of having to do. Like, we gotta show the Chicago artists, so we're doing this annual Chicago and Vicinity show, but that's all we're doing, basically. Or we celebrate artists as Chicago artists by founding, a gallery, the Chicago Room, the Chicago BorgWarner Gallery, and then the artists feel like they are being partitioned off and not part of the overall program. So the best thing to do is to integrate Chicago artists into the overall program, and I think that's what all local institutions that are more nationally and internationally focused, like Art Institute, MCA, and Renaissance Society, have been doing. So, that perception of Chicago in the latter half of the 20th century as the second city really finally has been put to bed. And it's so interesting to see the artists of the Chicago School, which spawned many alternative space, being rediscovered or discovered for the first time nationally, internationally, and really getting their due as a very vital and interesting group that came out of Chicago. We may have been a little sick of them here in the 70s, but unfortunately they weren't known more widely, and now they're showing in Europe quite often. In fact, Westerman has a big show coming up at the Reina Sofia, which is super exciting to me, next year. So I know there was a lot of material here, and I thank you all for your patience. Not too many people had to leave. And now I think we can open it for questions.
I have a mic right here in case anyone has a question ready.
Or a comment.
Give us just a few seconds to gather our thoughts. I can totally start.
Totally.
Lynn, I wonder what you think about the landscape of contemporary, as in right now, artist-run spaces, and how this kind of new 20th century logic to how artists are discovered, how that is kind of playing out in Chicago's artist-run, non-institutional spaces right now.
Yeah, the lines are really blurred at this point because some of these are basically artist-run, like 65 Grand, where I just was. But they're not getting a bunch of government grants, and that's what makes it a really different situation. Arc Gallery, which is still around, is member funded, and I think they do get some outside funding. But this whole phenomenon of the so-called apartment gallery, I know the Hyde Park Art Center did a big show trying to track all that a number of years ago now. And there's so many of them, and they come and go very quickly. And the artist curator line has been so blurred that in the old days, at the alternative spaces, unless it was a members cooperative, you didn't really put yourself in the shows. You hired a curator who maybe put you in the show, but now a lot of them are, the artists are the curator and they put themselves in the shows. It's just a really different world, and with the internet, it's very, very hard to draw complete parallels between then and now. But the thing that I can say is that impulse, that you're not getting anyone knocking on your studio door, or your presence on the internet hasn't brought you, representation at International Biennial. So you take matters into your own hands. And I think that's something that's happened so often in Chicago. And one of my motivations in doing the Alternative Spaces show is that the artists that started all the alternative spaces in the 70s had almost no knowledge of exhibition momentum. They had no knowledge of what had happened at the Art Institute earlier and what had caused, other spaces in Chicago, historic spaces, to open. But I think that's breaking down as well. There's more historical awareness, and I'm always surprised how many young artists come and want to research, alternative spaces or are doing projects on them themselves. So I think the short answer is artists are always going to want to take matters into their own hands. And it's a way to come to greater attention and maybe then have institutional coverage as well.
Thank you. Who's ready? We've gathered our thoughts.
No, they're recording it, so.
Well, I also think that Chicago has so many art schools, like, University of Illinois, our SAIC, the Northwestern, DePaul, and others that I'm not mentioning. And I think that's sort of fostered.
Columbia College.
Yeah, thank you. That's fostered some kind of energy here. Mm-hmm. That there aren't a lot of other cities have so many art schools within universities or whatever in one place.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and a whole lecture could be just done on that. And I touched on it a little bit because so much of the activity at the Art Institute really was Chicago School of the Art Institute based. Almost all the artists that showed in many of the programs had come from there. Interesting, I didn't mention it, but interestingly enough, when the School of the Art Institute opened its new building in it's my last year of art school, so it was 76. They opened a gallery as part of that facility, and that's when the Art Institute absolutely quit doing any one-person shows in the Art Institute. And yet, we saw a little bit, Institute of Design had such a rigorous and important curriculum, especially with photography. Some of those artists were being included, but, not integrated in the same way. Almost very few Northwestern, very few UIC. In the emerging shows in the 80s at the Renaissance Society, that represented a lot of those programs. But it's really been much more recent that so many of the art schools are really producing high-level graduates. But the thing still happens that happened back then is that many artists leave Chicago. And now we don't have such strict definition of, you have to only be known as a Chicago artist or whatever. You can just be based wherever and just do your art. So, but the mass of students graduating from our art schools is pretty unique in American cities, yeah.
I certainly, appreciate the conclusion that you came to of, the best means is to integrate Chicago artists into a greater context. I'm wondering, in your discussion about some of the women's galleries, if those galleries hadn't been started by artists, and knowing that so few museums had been showing women prior to that, would this integration have happened if these artists hadn't started something on their own to kind of bring attention to that? And perhaps the same continuing now with artists of color, et cetera.
No, that's fascinating, thank you. I did a lecture recently where I really just looked at women showing in Chicago in these institutions, basic same time range. And compared to non-Chicago institutions like New York or wherever, Chicago showed a lot of women, but that still was usually 30% or less. And that, needed redress, especially when women really started coming in equal numbers and greater numbers into art schools. Right after World War II, there was a huge influx of male artists at especially School of the Art Institute because they got their tuition paid by the GI Bill, and there weren't too many women GIs, so that really bumped up the attendance to be very male. But even at that time, there were a number of very significant Chicago women artists working, like Ellen Lanyon. But Ellen was actually one of the instigators of the feminist co-op alternative space movement, even though she had kind of left Chicago at that point. But she was working between the West Coast, the East Coast, and Chicago to try to raise consciousness about women and showing in more major institutions. And I know personally, having gone to ARC and Artemisia and seeing women artists show, that it definitely influenced my ability to say, yeah, we've got these amazing artists, let's show them, like Diane Simpson or Margaret Wharton or Phyllis Bramson. So in Chicago, we didn't have as much work to do, but we had work to do, and the feminist galleries really helped us with that work. With the minority situation, the Southside Center has been there forever, since the 30s, right? I mean, the Hyde Park Arts Center has shown huge numbers of local artists. So it's just a matter of really recognizing that. And in the Art Institute, too, they actually enrolled quite a few minority artists in the 20s and 30s when no one else would, like Archibald Motley. So that heritage is starting to show up more. And another one of the Terra Initiative shows is Charles White, African-American artist who was famously Carrie James Marshall's teacher. So I think some of that history is really being dug out thanks to the Terra initiative. It's part of my Art in Chicago project, but it was sort of the rediscovering of a history at that point. Now we're elucidating that history, thank goodness.
Who wants to take us out of here with one last question? Great, perfect.
At the Evanston Art Center, there was vicinity shows. Is that something else, or
Something else?
Evanston Art Center?
Yeah. Well, I didn't investigate them. I investigated major museums. I mean, you expect the Hyde Park Art Center to show mostly Chicago artists historically, which they did. And you expect the Evanston Art Center to show Evanston and other, local artists. Well, it was Chicago and vicinity, yeah. And I'm sure it was modeled after the Art Institute, but I didn't go into those sorts of institutions in this talk, yeah. Thank you very much for coming out.
Well, I want to add my thanks, of course, to Lynne Warren for this wonderful, informative presentation to everybody. And hopefully everybody is a little bit more knowledgeable, on Chicago art history after the presentation. And also, of course, I want to thank MCA for providing this wonderful venue for this presentation, and above all, to Terra Foundation. As Lynn mentioned, it's a wonderful initiative, with a lot of public free exhibits and other art activities around the city this whole year. As a matter of fact, there are, as part of this grant to University of Chicago's Graham School, there are 5 more art lectures coming up throughout the year. So now you're all on my list. If you haven't put down your name, there's a sign-up sheet at the back, and they're coming up. And also, just on the other, as a side note, University of Chicago's Graham School is a institution dedicated to lifelong learning. We also offer a lot of art programs and a lot of other liberal arts, courses. At the back, I have some copies of our catalog. For instance, this summer, we have courses on Chicago public art and Chicago photography, and there's also a very vibrant, dynamic how to view art program offered through the Graham School. So join us when you can. And thank you all for coming today. And thanks to Terra Foundation. Yeah.